I never thought my life would turn into such a cruel whirlwind. My daughter, still so young, turned up pregnant and from the married neighbor. Meanwhile, my husband was serving time in prison, about to be released in 3 months, and I trembled just imagining his reaction. He had always been an absent man at home, aggressive when he drank, and now fate seemed to mock me. How could I tell the truth without putting everyone at risk? It was like holding a bomb ready to explode in my own living room. And that's when I realized, either I fell apart once and for all, or I turned this tragedy into the beginning of our redemption. I had my hands in the sink, warm water, smelling of coconut soap, when I heard the lock click. My daughter walked in slowly, eyes red, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and I felt my heart tighten as if someone were wringing a cloth. I dried my hands on my worn-out blue apron, a gift from my mother. "Speak, my daughter, speak bluntly," I asked, feeling the kitchen shrink. In the window, the wind moved the curtain, and the street seemed to hold its breath. She sat down, didn't look me in the eye, and kept twirling the thin ring that shouldn't even be there. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, and time slammed on the back of my neck like a door on a windy day. The ticking noise of the wall clock became too loud. I breathed deeply through my nose, as I've learned when life decides to overdo it. "And the father?" I asked quietly, as if stepping on glass. She closed her eyes and said, "The neighbor, the married one." I felt the floor slip, as if the kitchen were turning uphill. His name crossed my mind along with the voices of his daughters playing on the sidewalk. The smell of brewed coffee turned sour, and the kettle whistled untimely. "Do you understand what this means?" I whispered, gripping the edge of the table. She cried without noise, clean tears, like late afternoon rain. I pulled out the chair, sat down next to it, and patted her back lightly. "First, we breathe. Then we organize," I said, my voice sounding firmer than I felt. Inside, the memory brought back another scene. Your father, my husband, 9 months away, counting the days until the gate opened. His face when he drank, heavy, tense, that poison that ignites fights even with a lamppost. He's 3 months away from leaving, I calculated, like someone who's short on cash. What if he finds out the wrong way? What if he finds out on the wrong day? I thought about the police officer, the night of the arrest, the uncontrolled punch that changed the fate of the house. My daughter squeezed my hand, like when she was little and afraid of thunder. "I was wrong, Mom," he said, and I heard truth in that sentence, not an excuse. I didn't pat myself on the head, but I didn't throw stones either. "We take responsibility for our mistakes. We manage the consequences," I replied, saving my tears for later. I got up, turned off the tap, and turned off the stove, as if tidying up the kitchen would bring sense into the world. I took paper and pen, sat down, and wrote 3 words: protect, organize, sustain. I stuck the paper on the fridge, right in the center, for everyone to see. I explained slowly, to protect you and this baby, to organize the steps, to keep the house standing. No shouting at the gate, no out-of-hours messages, no soap operas with an audience. "Who did you talk to?" I asked, and she shook her head. "No one." Then I would be the first and, for now, the only adult standing in this fire. My chest burned, but my feet held firm on the cold floor. The neighbor passed through his head like the shadow of a bird in the yard. I remembered his wife, shoulders slumped, with the kind look of someone who says good morning to everyone. I remembered the 2 girls on the pink bike, ribbons swinging from the handlebars. Anger and compassion clashed within me, like neighbors sharing a cracked wall. It's not about sparing adults from consequences, it's about not hurting any children, I thought. The sentence stayed there, hitting my mind like a hammer. I opened the window and let the morning in, even though it was scratching. I needed air to put things in the right place inside me. "Let's go to the health center and schedule prenatal care today," I decided, my whole body confirming the decision. My daughter nodded, her face tired and yet relieved to have a name for the path. "And Mom, Dad?" she asked, finally facing the seven-headed beast. The silence between us was long, but not cowardly. "Your father needs to know, but not now, not like this," I replied, measuring each word. "He has a history of explosions, and we have a history of survival." I thought about social services, the public defender's office, what I learned from listening to other women in line at the health center. I thought about letterhead, about an agreement, about mediation, about a neutral room with a door that closes from the inside. Life has taught me that shouting doesn't solve what a signature solves. And that haste is only good for putting out fires, not for planning a house. I made a new coffee, this time without the bitter taste of surprise. I added sugar, like someone sweetening news in their throat. "You will study your rights, and I will study mine," I said. "Let us walk with a doctor, with the law and with God watching, each one in his own square." She breathed easier, and so did I, because naming the path always clears the way. But deep down, another clock started ticking. 3 months. 3 months until the gate opens and the past enters with it, asking for a place at the table. 3 months to strengthen the foundations before the first tremor. 3 months to teach the house to speak firmly without shouting. I looked again at the note on the fridge. Protect, organize, sustain. "Let's start at the beginning," he said, extending his hand. Little did I know that before the end of that week, someone would knock on our gate and it wouldn't be to ask for sugar. That night, the clock on the wall seemed to speak too loudly, as if each tick was a reminder of what I could not forget. The yellow kitchen lamp cast long shadows on the tiles, and the kettle hissed without anyone ordering coffee. My daughter curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow that had seen better times. I sat in the armchair, facing the door, like a guard on duty who can't doze off. The silence had a smell, a mixture of detergent, old dust, and fresh fear. I breathed slowly, because rushing, at that moment, would only serve to break something inside us. The street, on the other side of the curtain, whispered neighborhood sounds, a creaking gate, an impatient dog, 2 stray laughs. I thought of the neighbors' daughters, their hair bows, their sing-song voices as they played hopscotch. His mistake was intertwined with their fate, and that not hurt me more than anger. I've felt burning anger before. This time, I felt a different kind of fire, one that requires care not to turn into a blaze. My hand itched to write more things on the fridge paper, but I left it as it was. Protect, organize, sustain. 3 pillars. 3 hammers. 3 reminders for when memory fails. My daughter broke the silence first in a whisper. "Mom, what if she hates me forever?" The question fell between us like a glass that doesn't quite shatter, but leaves a mark on the table. "Daughter, people aren't definitive sentences. Neither are wounds," I replied, calmly stitching together the words. She wiped her face on her sleeve and stared at the ceiling, as if searching for an exit sign. "I'll take responsibility for everything, Mom. I won't run away," she repeated, as if promising herself. I held that promise dearly, because young promises need an old hand nearby. I went to the room and came back with a shoebox. Inside, paid bills, receipts, certificates, small old salvages. I placed the box on the table and went through it item by item, teaching the language of letterhead. "A document is a voice that doesn't tremble," I said, and she nodded, more grown-up than she had been that morning. I set aside a new, transparent folder, like life asking us to see without distraction. There, I started the archive of our new beginning, names, dates, appointments, contacts. It seemed like bureaucracy. It was protection. Around midnight, the refrigerator burst, and the house responded with a shiver through the walls. I made 2 teas, one chamomile, the other lemon balm, and the kitchen smelled like an old backyard. "Are you going to be able to sleep?" I asked, knowing the answer. "If you sit on my bed and tell that story about the day Daddy took you dancing," she risked a smile. I told him, and as I remembered my clumsy steps and my heel that broke on the way out, I understood the cruelty of time. That man had light, and he had shadows that he himself lit. When she fell asleep, her breathing softly, I listened to her body reminding me that life is stubborn. I ran my hand slowly over the blanket, as if blessing without making a sound. In the hallway, the photographs, first communions, birthdays, the same old beach, looked at me with questions. I answered in my mind. I stay. I endure. I guide. With each answer, my chest hurt less and weighed more. This paradox is curious. I went back to the living room and turned off the lights, leaving just one on, like a lighthouse on a small pier. I sat at the table and wrote a note to myself. Tomorrow, gas station, public defender's office, market. Underneath, I wrote, no arguing at the gate. No blaming children. No gossip. The pen failed. It scratched crookedly, and I smiled at my tired handwriting. In the window, a moth insisted on the light, and I thought about how many times I also insisted on the wrong light. I thought about the fallen police officer from that long ago night, the siren, the handcuffs, my scream that never came out. I promised the woman of yesterday that the woman of today would leave nothing unnamed. The sofa held the scent of life lived, cheap soap, hair cream, a hint of hand sanitizer. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the house like someone reading a map. The wooden floor, the dripping faucet, the wind on the tiles. Everything said that the structure was old, but stubborn. That's how we are, I murmured, and I felt a small sense of pride, the kind that sustains the great. I walked around the rooms, checked the lock, and put the chair back in place. Small rituals that remind the house who is in charge of fear. In the early morning, I woke up to the sound of a message on my cell phone. It was from my sister. If you need anything, come here without warning. The door is ajar. I read it twice and left the screen lit on the dresser as a safety candle. Gratitude has a warmth of its own. It warms without burning. It embraces without squeezing. I replied, I'm here. I'm strong. Thank you for being my second ground. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come back with me. Before the sun rose, I sat on the edge of my bed and prayed in my own way, simply, without any difficult words. I asked for wisdom in a low voice, like someone who asks to borrow salt from a neighbor. I asked for strength without arrogance, because too much strength also brings down. I asked for silence within, of those who do not hide, only support. When the first light streaked across the room, I already knew the first step of the day. And, strangely, I also sensed that the second step would not be taken by me. Because, even before coffee, a sound came from the gate, dry, impatient, determined. The neighbor's dog barked differently, and the birds fell silent for a moment. My hand stopped on the sugar bowl, and the kettle groaned as if sensing trouble. I looked around the room, at the old wedding photo, at the clear folder on the table. I left the cloth in the sink, took a deep breath, and walked. When I opened the door, it wasn't the mailman. And he wasn't alone. The sound at the gate echoed deep within me, as if iron had struck my soul. My daughter woke up scared, her eyes wide, without needing to ask anything. I waved my hand at her to be quiet, but I know even her heart held its breath. I walked slowly, each step heavy, as if the ground would measure my courage. The icy doorknob chilled my fingers, but the warm blood ran faster through my veins. At that moment, I felt that opening a door could change the course of our story. On the other side was the neighbor's wife, her eyes red from crying. Behind her, one of her daughters held a rag doll, the kind worn out by affection. There were no shouts, no accusations, just a tense silence, like a cloud threatening heavy rain. She held a crumpled envelope with my name written shakily on it. Her voice was hoarse. We need to talk before it's too late. And I knew it wasn't just about pregnancy or cheating. It was about dignity. I invited her in, but she shook her head firmly, refusing. He preferred to stay at the gate, as if drawing an invisible line of limit and respect. My daughter appeared in the hallway, hesitant, and upon seeing her, the woman looked away. There was so much pain there, but also a strange kind of care. "I didn't come to apologize or make a fuss," she said. "I came to say that I know, and that I won't destroy children because of the wrong adults." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, I felt like we were all standing on the same cracked ground. I took the envelope and pressed it to my chest, not daring to open it in front of her. My teary eyes met hers, and I realized that neither of us were complete villains. She was angry, of course, but she was also afraid that the girls' lives would be marked by hatred. "Your husband's leaving soon, isn't he?" she asked. I nodded. "Then prepare his heart. Because if he comes after mine, I won't hold him back." The warning sounded like a knife, but also like a thinly disguised prayer. After she left, I closed the door slowly, leaning my forehead against the cool wood. My daughter ran to me, trembling, as if she had seen the entire future in just a few minutes. I opened the envelope. Inside, an ultrasound, the silent proof of a life that no one asked for, but that already existed. The little heart beating in black and white seemed to mock our certainties. My daughter collapsed to the floor, sobbing, and I knelt beside her, embracing the fragility that only a mother understands. "This isn't the end, daughter. It's a curve. And curves also lead forward." I spent the entire day with the ultrasound in my bag, as if it were a secret document. I went to the market, came back, made lunch, but with each movement, the paper seemed to weigh more than full bags. I looked at the neighbors from afar, wondering who already knew, who was whispering behind the curtains. At the bakery checkout, I had the impression that people took longer than usual to look at me. It was paranoia, perhaps, but shame, when it wants to, even invents witnesses. I got home tired, but my head was too full to lie down. That evening I sat with my daughter and showed her the ultrasound again. "See this? This is life. And life, my daughter, we don't deny, we don't hide. We face it." She cried silently, and I knew that each tear was also a dose of forced maturity. "But Mom, what about Dad?" she asked, always returning to the point where my heart ached. "Your father will have to choose whether he will be a man of the past or of the future," I replied, with a firmness that surprised me. At that moment, I realized that I myself was changing, forged by the fire of crisis. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. The ceiling seemed to speak to me in codes that only the tired can understand. I closed my eyes and saw the ultrasound image blinking like a lighthouse in a rough sea. I wondered how many generations of women had carried burdens like this, between silence and courage. With each thought, the answer came within. All of them. And now it's your turn. I didn't cry out loud, because crying out loud betrays weakness to thin walls. But I cried inside, and inside I also drown. In the early morning, I got up and wrote a short letter to my husband, which I kept inside the Bible on the bookshelf. I didn't know if I would deliver it the day he left, but I needed to record what I felt. I wrote that his time of rage had to end, or he would lose everything again. I wrote that I would not beg for peace, but that I was ready to fight for it. And I wrote that there was a new life on the way, asking for a place in the world, without guilt. I signed it simply with your wife, because there was no room for poetry there, only truth. When the sun came up, I went into the backyard and left the letter on the clothesline, just to watch the paper flutter. The wind blew, and for a second I felt it respond, firm, yet gentle. I went back inside, took a deep breath and looked at my daughter, who had just woken up. "Today we start differently," I said. She smiled weakly, but it was enough for me to believe her. And for the first time in weeks, I prepared coffee without rushing, as if rehearsing normality. The days began to pass, as if they were thick drops falling from a broken clock. Each morning seemed longer than the night before, and the wait for my husband to leave ate away at me. My daughter was no longer sleeping well, her belly growing silently, revealing the secret that the entire neighborhood would soon notice. I pretended to be normal, but even the kettle on the stove seemed to whistle louder, as if screaming our hidden guilt. The walls of the house were no longer just walls. They were silent witnesses to every contained sigh. And I felt that every day the prison door was getting closer to opening. I began to notice details that had previously escaped me. The noise of neighbors whispering in the backyard, the curtains moving too slowly, the forced silence as I passed by. It was as if the entire street knew about the ultrasound I kept in my bag, as if the eyes of others could already read my destiny. My poor daughter avoided even looking in the mirror, afraid of seeing the reflection of a judgment that hadn't even arrived yet. I, as a mother, tried to hold her, but I was also falling apart inside. My heart, fragile as crystal, knew the worst was yet to come. The clock didn't stop, and with each tick, the fear multiplied. At this point, I decided to write letters to myself, as little reminders that I couldn't fall apart. I kept everything in the kitchen drawer, along with cutlery that we hardly ever used. The letters were short, but each word tasted like a tear. Be strong. It's not your fault. Tomorrow can be better. Sometimes, rereading it, it felt like another woman was talking to me, one more assertive than I had ever been. Maybe it was life training me for the war that would come with his return. Maybe it was just my way of not losing my sanity completely. My daughter, despite everything, began to show small gestures of courage. One day, she prepared lunch by herself and left the plate on the table, as if she were a fully fledged adult. The other day, she asked me if she could embroider a cloth for the baby, and the embroidery came out crooked, but full of love. Each attempt of hers was a way of saying that she wanted to move forward, even if she stumbled. I watched her silently, my chest tight, remembering when she was still little and ran around the yard barefoot. Now her steps were heavy, but they bore the mark of early responsibility. At night, when we went to bed, she would always ask, "Mom, what if he doesn't accept it?" My answer never changed. We'll face it. But deep down, I was afraid of my husband's reaction, a man whom alcohol had always turned into a beast. He didn't know if prison had softened him or hardened him further. He didn't know if, when he left, he was going to hug his daughter or raise his fist at her. And this doubt was the poison that ate away at me every morning. I started having strange dreams, always about doors and padlocks. In some, I tried to open the prison door, but the key wouldn't turn. In others, he was the one who opened the front door, and behind him came a dark storm. I woke up sweaty, with my heart racing, and prayed silently that it was just a dream. But the fear that it was an omen kept me from breathing in peace. In the end, all that was left was to cling to the letters I wrote myself. Time was becoming my most intimate enemy. Each crossed-out calendar reminded me that the day was coming. Visits to prison didn't help, as he barely spoke, and when he did, it was only about longing and regret. I listened to him, but I kept wondering if that regret was genuine or just the loneliness of a cell. He always promised that he would come back different, but I had already heard too many promises over the years. And promises, when not kept, weigh more than chains. My daughter sometimes tried to believe that he would change. "Maybe Daddy will come back all right, Mom," she said, as if asking for a bedtime story. I smiled, not having the courage to destroy her hope, but inside I knew the world wasn't that simple. A man doesn't change overnight just because the cell closed behind him. But I also didn't want to condemn him prematurely. After all, everyone deserves a chance to start over. The question was, would he seize the chance or would he throw it away again? In the last days before his release, I began to prepare the house in silence. I changed the sheets, washed the clothes, and tidied the closet as if that would calm the storm. My daughter helped me, and together we tried to create the illusion that it was just another return trip. But inside me, every fold of clothing felt like a disguise for fear. It was as if I was decorating the field before battle. And the damn clock kept counting down. The last night before leaving, I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the wind blowing against the tiles and the dog barking in the distance. I made strong coffee, but I didn't touch the cup. It was as if my body was present, but my soul was already waiting for the impact of the next morning. When the day dawned, I felt that it wasn't just my husband who would be released from prison. It was also the sentence on our fate as a family. The sun rose differently that day, heavy, as if carrying in each ray the memory of what was about to happen. I woke up before dawn, my heart beating like a war drum inside my chest. My daughter was still asleep, but I knew her sleep was light, full of startles and broken dreams. I got up slowly, made a strong coffee, and stared at the clock on the wall, which seemed to mock my anxiety. Each minute took a while to pass, but at the same time the morning passed like a breeze. It was the day the prison doors would open and my family's destiny would change course. I went to get him alone. I didn't want to take my daughter, because I was afraid of the shock of the reunion. The drive to the penitentiary seemed longer than usual, and every turn in the road reminded me of past mistakes. I told myself that I needed to be firm, that I couldn't waver right now. When I arrived, I saw men leaving with cloth bags, some with their heads down, others smiling for no reason. My husband appeared last, his face thinner, his eyes sunken, but with the same way of walking. It was him, and it wasn't, as if time had marked the body but not revealed the soul. He looked at me from afar, and, for an instant, I saw tenderness. I ran to him, but held back my emotions halfway, remembering the weight that awaited me at home. We hugged, and I smelled the smell of iron and longing impregnated in his clothes. "I'm ready to change," were the first words he said, but I already knew the fragility of promises. Still, I squeezed his hand, and we walked home in silence. When we arrived, my daughter was at the door, her eyes torn between love and fear. She ran into his arms, and the embrace was long but hesitant, as if there were a chasm in between. He caressed her face and said, "You've grown up." She bit her lip, hiding the truth that was pulsing in her belly. I stood back, watching, knowing the scene was beautiful, but fragile, about to break. And the question echoed inside me. When he finds out, what will he do? Lunch was silent. Each spoonful of beans sounded louder than words. He spoke little, asking about things around the house, the neighborhood, as if trying to return to a lost routine. My daughter responded politely, but avoided looking him in the eye for too long. I saw a slight tremor in her hands, revealing the secret she carried. My husband didn't seem to notice, or maybe he pretended not to see. But I knew that disguise wouldn't last long. In the afternoon, he wanted to walk around the yard, looking at the trees, as if trying to regain ground. He stopped in front of the old lemon tree and said, "Not everything dies, right? It just needs strong roots." I looked at my daughter, and she looked away, as if his words were an arrow. Inside, I fought the urge to speak up, to rip off the bandage at once. But I preferred to wait, thinking that perhaps the right moment would reveal itself. Silence, however, was a double-edged sword. At the end of the day, he took my hand and said, "I know I messed up, but now I want to be different." There was sincerity in the tone, but also fear, the fear of losing family. I wanted to believe, but my heart was suspicious of everything. And there was still the secret that could destroy any attempt at a new beginning. My daughter locked herself in her room early, claiming to be tired. And I stayed in the room with him, in silence, listening to the sound of the clock marking the beginning of a new era. When we went to bed, I noticed he was still having nightmares, turning over in bed and mumbling random words. The prison still seemed to live inside him, like an open scar. I touched his shoulder, and he held my hand as if asking for an anchor. "Don't leave me alone," he whispered, almost asleep. And I understood that his fight was just beginning, but mine too. That night, as sleep eluded me, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the future. There was a baby on the way, a scared daughter, and a husband on the verge of becoming engaged. It was like balancing three storms in the same fragile little boat. But inside me, a flame insisted on not going out, the hope that life could finally be transformed. And even though I was scared, I was ready to face whatever came. Because this is what being a mother is, rowing even when the sea insists on turning against you. The days that followed his return were like walking on broken glass. Everything seemed normal on the outside, but inside the house the air was heavy, full of screaming silences. My daughter avoided spending too much time alone with her father, always finding excuses to go away. I watched her every gesture, every glance she glanced away, and I knew the weight of the truth was crushing the girl. My husband, on the other hand, looked suspicious, like someone who smells smoke but doesn't yet see the fire. And I, in the middle, was the fragile wall trying to hold a secret that no longer fit between four walls. One afternoon, while we were cleaning the kitchen, he touched his daughter's belly and said, "You're looking more bloated, girl. Are you eating too much?" My daughter froze, her face lost color, and I rushed to change the subject, talking about the beans that were on the stove. He laughed, but it was a short laugh, the kind that doesn't convince anyone. I knew we didn't have much time before the bomb went off. It was as if every minute was a slowly burning fuse. At night, I found my daughter crying softly in her room. I sat on the edge of the bed, and she collapsed into my lap, saying she couldn't hide it anymore. "He'll find out, Mom. I don't know what's going to happen to me." I hugged her tightly, feeling her heart racing against my chest. I promised I would be by her side no matter what. And at that moment I decided, the secret would have to be revealed by us, not by the whispers of the neighborhood. The next day I wrote a short letter to my husband, but I didn't deliver it. I preferred to imagine how he would react when he read each word. The sentences were direct. "Your daughter is pregnant. We need you, not your anger." I kept the letter hidden inside the closet, as if it were a defensive weapon. At the same time, I rehearsed in front of the mirror what I would say looking into his eyes. But every time I imagined the scene, my legs trembled as if they couldn't support my own weight. Little by little, I began to notice changes in him. He drank less coffee, stared into space more, and sometimes ran his hand over his forehead as if trying to organize his confused thoughts. He asked indirectly about his daughter's school, about friendships, trying to piece together an invisible puzzle. I pretended to be natural, but inside the pressure was unbearable. It was like seeing a smoking volcano about to spew lava. And I didn't know whether the eruption would bring destruction or renewal. My daughter, in turn, began to hide in loose clothing, but the body does not lie. The neighbors were already whispering louder, and even in the market, I felt eyes weighing on us. Every time someone approached me to comment on some banality, I was afraid that the sentence would end with a revelation. It was suffocating to live like this, waiting for the truth to slip through the cracks. And, even worse, knowing that my husband couldn't stand secrets. The man who had left prison wanted control, and control does not go hand in hand with lies. One Sunday, during lunch, the tension reached its limit. He put his fork down on the table and stared at his daughter with fixed eyes. "Do you have something to tell me?" he asked, his voice heavy. My daughter nearly fainted in her chair, her face as white as the tablecloth. My heart raced, and I knew it was now or never. But before any words could be spoken, the phone rang in the room, shattering the moment like an unexpected clap of thunder. I ran to answer it. The voice on the other end was the neighbor's wife. She cried, saying she could no longer bear to hold the truth alone. He doesn't have the courage to admit it, but I know what happened. I know his daughter is expecting his child. My legs were shaking. I almost dropped the device from my hand. I looked at the table and saw my husband with his arms crossed, waiting. It was the beginning of the end of half measures. I walked back into the room trembling, trying to hide it, but he was no fool. "Who was it?" he asked dryly, without blinking. I swallowed hard and said, "It was the neighbor." He narrowed his eyes and repeated, "What's going on here?" My daughter cried nonstop, her hands shaking in her lap. And I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I took a deep breath, held her hand, and decided to speak. The words came out slowly, drawn out, like stones being pushed uphill. "She's pregnant." The silence was absolute, so heavy it seemed to echo. He blinked a few times, as if in disbelief. Then he looked at his daughter's belly, and the truth fell upon him like bricks from a crumbling wall. It was the moment when everything could collapse or, who knows, begin to be rebuilt. The silence that fell over that room was more cruel than any scream. My husband stood there, staring at his daughter, as if trying to decipher a riddle he didn't want to believe. The spoon was still trembling on the table, abandoned, and the beans were getting cold on the plate. My daughter cried softly, her eyes pleading for mercy. As I stood there, I felt my legs weaken, but I remained firm, because I knew that moment would define the destiny of our family. Time seemed suspended, each second a weight on our shoulders. Suddenly, he stood up, pushing his chair so hard that it almost toppled over. His gaze burned like embers, but at the same time there was a shadow of pain. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice trembling, almost a whisper. My daughter couldn't answer. She just nodded, her face hidden in her hands. He took a deep breath, and the air came out as a roar that had been held in for years. It was the old man fighting with the new within him. For a moment I feared that violence would speak louder, as it had so often in the past. But he remained motionless, his hands clenched, his body rigid as stone. He looked at me, and in that look there was as much hatred as a cry for help. "Did you know?" he said, and I couldn't deny it. I nodded slowly, admitting yes. It was as if I had opened a second wound in his heart. He began to pace aimlessly around the room, mumbling incoherent sentences. My daughter, pregnant with that wretched neighbor. The name didn't need to be said, the silence already gave it away. His anger was growing, and I feared the front door would be his next destination. If he went after his neighbor, there would be no turning back. My role was to prevent that from happening. I approached slowly, touched his arm, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't push me away. "I know it hurts," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "But this house can't take any more violence. If you love your daughter, you'll have to prove it now." He looked at me like I had just defused a bomb. The teary, red eyes revealed a broken man. The mask of fury began to give way to true pain. My daughter, still in tears, got up and went to him. With a trembling voice, he murmured, "Father, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disappoint you." It was at that moment that something broke inside him. His previously clenched hands unclenched, and he pulled his daughter into an awkward but genuine hug. The tears he was holding back fell silently. The scene, painful and improbable, seemed almost a miracle. He didn't talk about forgiveness, nor about the future. He just stood there, hugging his daughter, breathing heavily, as if he were learning to be a father all over again. I watched in silence, feeling that this was the first step on a long journey. The fury had not disappeared, but it was tamed by moments of humanity. And that was more than I expected. It was proof that prison might have left scars that could be learned. When he pulled away, he wiped away the tears with the back of his hand. He looked at me and simply said, "I need to think." He went out into the yard, sat down under the lemon tree, and remained there, motionless, until the sun went down. The daughter remained in the room, crying until she fell asleep. And I was left alone in the kitchen, my heart still racing, but also with a spark of hope. Perhaps the worst was over, but the future was still open. That night, he went back inside without saying a word. He lay down on the bed, turned his back to me, and slept silently. but the heaviness of his breathing said more than any speech. He was a man fighting against himself, trying not to repeat the mistakes that landed him in prison. I closed my eyes, thankful that we had survived that day without tragedy, and I prayed that life would give us strength for what was yet to come. It was at that moment that I realized his reaction wasn't just a fright. It was also a new beginning. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but there was the possibility of reconstruction. I knew we would still face the neighborhood, the betrayed wife, and his own pride. But for the first time in a long time, there was a chance that we wouldn't be destroyed by the fury. And that chance, small as it was all I needed to keep fighting. It didn't take long for the whole street to start buzzing with comments. The whispers that were once discreet now turned into entire sentences, spoken out loud just for us to hear. My daughter no longer had the courage to go to the bakery alone, afraid of the dirty looks. I myself, when I passed through the gate, felt my back burn as if all the eyes in the neighborhood were glued to me. And deep down, it was true. No one is quick to forgive a story like that, especially when it involves neighbors and betrayal. The neighborhood became our court, and we, the silent defendants. The neighbor's wife began to walk around with her chest puffed out, as if she held the sentence of our misfortune in her hands. He said that what is hidden sooner or later comes to light, looking straight at me. Other women feigned solidarity, but I could see the bitter taste of gossip in their eyes. It was as if my daughter's suffering had become a spectacle for those who had nothing better to do. People fed on history as if it were fresh bread for afternoon tea, and each malicious word deepened the wound we already had at home. My husband, contrary to what I feared, did not explode against the neighborhood. He walked with his head down, avoiding contact, as if he were carrying a cross on his shoulders. But I could sense the fury in his clenched fists whenever someone whispered too close. It was a dangerous silence, which could turn into a storm at any moment. So I was always on high alert, ready to intervene if his anger boiled over. It was a fragile balance between dignity and explosion. My daughter started missing school, claiming headaches. I knew it wasn't illness, but shame. Classmates were already whispering in the corridors, and the teachers, even though silent, were letting out disapproving looks. It was cruel to see my little girl, who had always been cheerful, now shrinking from the world. I tried to convince her to move on, but I also understood the weight she carried. No one comes out of collective judgment unscathed. One day, one of my older neighbors, whom I always respected, stopped me on the street. He said softly, "Come on, ma'am. Today they talk about you, tomorrow they talk about someone else." Those simple words were an unexpected relief in the midst of the storm. I realized that, even in the midst of evil, there were still people with a little humanity. And I held on to that, so I wouldn't fall apart completely. Not all was lost, even if the world seemed to be falling down around us. At home, I started to create a routine to protect my daughter. He accompanied her on every outing, controlled her schedule, and avoided exposing her to comments as much as possible. But at the same time, I felt that overprotection could suffocate her even more. It was as if I were trying to hide a flower in the middle of spring, preventing it from being seen. But the problem wasn't the flower, but the poisoned soil in which we were planted. And I didn't know if we could survive it. My husband, little by little, began to see the neighborhood in a different light. He no longer responded to the provocations, he just walked straight past, as if he didn't owe an explanation. I didn't know if it was strength or weakness, but it was better this way than seeing him behind bars again. He simply said, "The world talks, but we know the truth about our home." And despite all the pain, those words sounded like armor. It was a way of reminding us that the family needed to protect itself from the inside out. My daughter, over time, began to accept that she couldn't hide forever. One day, he decided to go to the bakery with me, even though he was scared. He walked in with his head held high, and even with the whispers around him, he didn't lower his eyes. It was a small step, but to me it felt like she had climbed a mountain. I saw in that attitude the beginning of the courage I had been waiting for. Because life, sooner or later, demands from us the determination to keep moving forward. But still, the neighborhood's wound left deep scars. The nights were long, full of bad thoughts, and the days were heavy as lead. It was as if every mean word stuck to the skin, leaving invisible scars. I knew time would help heal, but it wouldn't completely erase it. The entire neighborhood now knew our pain, and there was no turning back. All that remained was to learn to survive the sharp tongues of others. And it was in this hardship that I realized something important. The neighborhood could point fingers at us, laugh, judge us, but they had no power over the love we were trying to rebuild at home. What killed us wasn't the whispers, but how we dealt with them. If we wanted to survive, we needed to learn to transform shame into resistance. It was the lesson that was beginning to unfold before my eyes. And I knew this lesson would take us even further than we imagined. Fate would have it that she was the one knocking on our door on a rainy afternoon. The neighbor's wife entered without asking permission, bringing with her a mixture of anger and tiredness. The umbrella was dripping water onto the floor, but she didn't care. He looked me firmly in the eye and said, "Enough pretending. Your daughter carries a truth that my husband doesn't have the courage to admit." My hands instantly froze, and my daughter, who was listening from the kitchen, dropped the glass she was holding. The sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot in the heavy silence of the house. She sat down without waiting for an invitation, adjusting her skirt as if she owned the place. "I didn't come here for pity," she began, "but because I can no longer carry this burden alone." His voice trembled between hatred and compassion, and I didn't know which side would win. My daughter, huddled in the corner, looked like a cornered bird, unable to take flight. I looked at her and felt a pain that couldn't fit in my chest. It was too cruel to see her face the wife of the man who had stolen her innocence. My husband appeared in the room soon after, and the atmosphere exploded. Upon seeing him, the neighbor raised her finger and said, "Now you know the truth, don't you? The father of the child your daughter is carrying is the same man who swears eternal love to me." My husband stood frozen, his eyes wide, as if he had been dealt another blow by life. He looked at me for confirmation, and I just lowered my head. It was useless to deny what was already wide open. The neighbor's wife began to cry, but they were not tears of weakness. It was a cry filled with anger, with humiliation, of a wounded woman who still remained standing. "I'm going to separate," he said between sobs. "But you better get ready, because there won't be any peace for anyone in this neighborhood." Each word was a sentence, a harbinger of declared war. My daughter was trembling, clinging to the hem of my blouse. And I knew that from then on, the fight would not only be against shame, but against her revenge as well. My husband tried to speak, but the woman wouldn't let him. "Don't you dare defend this scoundrel. Don't even try to clear his name. You know as well as I do that he was no good." She stood up suddenly, slamming her hand on the table, and added, "But the child is not to blame. And that's the only reason I still have a shred of humanity in my heart." He left without looking back, leaving the door open with the wind and rain invading our room. Her trail remained with us like an open scar. When silence returned, my husband sat on the couch, defeated. There were no more doubts, no more disguises. My daughter cried profusely, apologizing between sobs. I hugged her, repeating that it wasn't her fault, that she wasn't the shame the neighborhood made her out to be. But deep down I knew that the weight of those words from my neighbor would still echo for a long time. It was impossible not to feel the force of social condemnation on our shoulders. In the following days, the woman spread her version of the story throughout the neighborhood. She said she had been betrayed not only by her husband, but also by life. Some saw her as a victim, others as an avenger. In any case, our house became the target of even more cruel looks. My husband no longer went out the gate, and my daughter locked herself in her room. And I felt like a soldier in a trench, defending a fortress that was crumbling from within. There was, however, an unexpected visit from her a few days later. She came back calmer, but still with a firm look in her eyes. "I don't hate your daughter," he said, looking straight at me. "I hate my husband's cowardice, yes. But if there's one thing I've learned in this life, it's that pain can teach you more than hate." I was speechless. I just nodded, my eyes welling up. It was a thread of truce in the midst of so much crossfire. Before leaving, she looked at my daughter and said, "Take care of this child. Don't let the mistakes of adults rob him of his chance to live." He left without waiting for an answer, leaving in the air a mixture of threat and advice. My daughter cried again, but this time there was something different about her tears. They seemed to be not just of pain, but also of a strange relief that she was no longer hidden. The truth already had an owner, it had already been exposed, and now it was up to them to face the consequences. And I, in the midst of it all, noticed something clear as the light that comes through the window after a storm. The neighbor's wife, with all her anger and suffering, was right in her words. The child was not to blame. And perhaps, deep down, this was the only truth capable of uniting us amidst so much rubble. Because, in the end, it was this new life that we needed to fight for. And there was no neighborhood, no resentment that could change that. After that devastating visit from the neighbor's wife, my house fell silent. My husband, once so reactive, now seemed to walk with a shadow over his shoulders. He would sit for hours in the backyard, staring into space, as if searching for answers in every leaf that fell from the lemon tree. I knew that inside him there was a huge struggle, the instinct for revenge against his neighbor, and the responsibility that was knocking on the door, demanding a different attitude. The burden of fatherhood was no longer a distant concept. Now it stood before him, implacable, demanding decision. My daughter avoided looking at her father. If there was fear before, now there was also guilt. She wondered if she deserved his love after all. And I, as a mother, tried to stitch together the pieces of a fractured relationship. But it was like trying to pick up broken glass with my bare hands. With each attempt, I hurt myself a little more. Still, I couldn't give up. On a Sunday night, the tension finally exploded into words. He called his daughter into the living room to talk, and I stood at a distance, listening to each syllable weigh in the air. "Do you know what it means to be a mother, girl?" he asked, his voice deep, but not shouting. My daughter responded only with tears, unable to articulate a sentence. He sighed deeply and added, "Because for many years, I didn't know what it meant to be a father." That unexpected confession tore at the souls of all of us. It was as if he had finally recognized his own absence. He said that when he was free, he only had time for friends and drinking. Who never noticed his daughter's silences, nor his wife's hidden tears. And if fate was now exacting such a high price from him, it was also to teach him. My hands were shaking as I listened to that, because it was the first time my husband had spoken about himself without masks. It was as if prison had released a part of him I never knew. He looked at his daughter and said something that stuck with me. "I can't be the father of the child you're carrying, but I can be a grandfather. And I will be. Whether you like it or not, I'll be here." My daughter burst into tears, but this time she hugged her father. It was an awkward hug, full of tears, but also full of promise. I felt that at that moment a bridge was being rebuilt, and even if it was fragile, it was a start. In the days that followed, I watched my husband try to be different. It wasn't perfect. There were still temper tantrums, there were still heavy silences. But he began to accompany his daughter to doctor's appointments, asking about the baby, trying to understand what was to come. Each small gesture was a new brick placed in that relationship. And I, for the first time in years, began to believe that he could change. That fatherhood, even if late, had finally fallen upon him like a calling. But along with this transformation also came fear. I knew the anger toward the neighbor hadn't gone away yet. She was just asleep, like a cornered beast. And every time we passed him on the street, I could feel the tension in my husband's body, as if he needed to hold himself back from acting. It was a daily battle against himself, and I feared that with any slip-up, everything would go up in smoke. Still, I realized that the love for my daughter was beginning to speak louder. He no longer spoke of revenge as often. He talked more about the future, about how he would protect his granddaughter, who was on the way. And that, for me, was a miracle I never imagined I would witness. Seeing a man marked by violence learn to talk about care was rare, and I silently gave thanks for every sign of that change. My daughter gradually began to regain her confidence. She no longer cried as much at night, and even risked smiling when her father asked about her pregnancy cravings. It was as if the weight of fatherhood that had previously crushed him now also served as support. My husband discovered, every day, that being a father wasn't just about giving orders, but being present. And this learning transformed not only him, but all of us. It was a second chance that life, with all its harshness, was offering. Deep down, I knew that nothing would erase what happened. But I also knew that that child's future could be different. Because, in the end, the weight of fatherhood didn't fall solely on my husband. It fell upon us all. And the way we carried this burden would define the course of our history. It was a collective responsibility, an opportunity to start over. With each passing day, I noticed my husband's struggle to control his own demons. But it was as if he carried a chained beast inside his chest, ready to escape at the slightest carelessness. The neighbors, with their venomous words, poked this beast without knowing the risk they were running. And I lived in a constant state of alert, observing his gestures, his expressions, trying to anticipate the explosion. It was a fragile balance, like walking on glass without breaking it. And one dirty look was enough for everything to almost fall apart. The neighbor, the real culprit of that pain, had the audacity to act as if nothing had happened. He greeted others on the street, tended the garden, even laughed out loud during weekend barbecues. It was as if he was deliberately mocking our pain. I saw my husband clench his fists, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the enemy, who pretended to be an exemplary family man. In that silence, there was more hatred than in any words. And I knew one false step would be enough, and blood could flow. There was an afternoon when I almost lost the strength to contain him. We were returning from the market when we crossed paths with our neighbor, who was arm in arm with his wife. He smiled, but not an innocent smile. It was a mockery of provocation. My husband took half a step forward, and the air around us grew heavy. I touched his arm tightly and whispered, "It's not worth it, for God's sake." He took a deep breath, turned his face away, and we continued walking, but the poison was already inside him. At home, he locked himself in his room for hours. I heard him pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Suddenly, the sound of a punch against the wall echoed through the house, making my daughter flinch. I ran to him and found his fist bleeding, his eyes red with pent-up rage. "If I touch him, I'll go back to jail." "But the urge eats away at me," he confessed, his voice breaking. I held his wounded hand and felt, more than ever, that his battle was with himself. My daughter was crying softly in her room, hearing everything. I knew that no matter how much my husband tried to change, the shadow of the past still weighed heavily on us. The aggression that once destroyed our peace was still there, just dormant. And I wondered how long we would be able to hold back this volcano that was about to explode. It was painful to watch his struggle, but it was also proof that he at least wanted to be different. I wanted to break the cycle, even if I stumbled over my own scars. One night, he opened up to me like never before. He said that in prison he learned how fragile freedom is, and that he didn't want to lose it again. But he also confessed that he dreamed of suffocating his neighbor with his own hands. It was a raw, brutal confession that left me silent for long minutes. Then he added, "It's you and our daughter who hold me back. Only you." In that instant, I realized that our presence, was the only antidote to his fury. Even so, the tension was reflected in every detail of everyday life. He avoided social gatherings, spoke to almost no one, and any noise from next door made him uneasy. The fury, contained, manifested itself in heavy silences, in short breaths, in fixed looks, and I felt like I was living on hot coals, trying not to feed the fire. My pregnant daughter needed peace, but the atmosphere inside the house was too dense. It was like we were walking through a minefield every day. Despite this, there were glimmers of hope. At doctor's appointments, he would hold his daughter's hand and get emotional when he heard the baby's heartbeat. In that small sound, he seemed to find a reason to control himself. It was living proof that the future could be bigger than revenge. And I clung to those moments like someone clinging to a plank in the middle of a shipwreck, because he knew that was where the chance for redemption lay. But on sleepless nights, I still feared the beast would escape. I knew that all it took was one mistake, one untimely meeting, for everything to fall apart. Fate seemed to be playing with us, stretching the rope until it almost broke. And I wondered if, when the moment came, he would choose love or violence. This doubt gnawed at me inside, but it also kept me alert, because pent-up rage is often more dangerous than unleashed rage. And so we continue, day after day, living on this tightrope between destruction and beginning again. I didn't know what the future held for us, but one thing was certain. The real test was yet to come. The neighborhood, the unborn child, my husband's wounded pride, it was all gunpowder. And I just prayed that when the spark came, he had learned not to strike the match. Because if there wasn't, there would be no going back. That cold morning, my daughter woke me up with a choked voice. "Mom, I think the time has come." Her eyes were watery, not just from fear, but from a mixture of pain and anticipation. We rushed to gather our things, and my husband, even though he was trembling, grabbed the car keys as if he were holding on to his own life. On the way to the hospital, the silence was broken only by her moans and the racing hearts of all of us. It was as if destiny had marked that moment to turn our page. In the hospital, every second seemed like an eternity. My daughter squeezed my hand with a strength I couldn't even imagine could fit in her delicacy. My husband paced the hallway like a caged beast, but this time not out of anger, but out of helplessness. It was the first time I saw him so small in the face of life. And oddly enough, it was also the first time I saw him so human. The weight of waiting united us in silence. When the baby's loud cry echoed down the hallway, something shifted inside us. It was as if that sound broke through walls, grudges, and hurts, bringing with it a new chance. My husband burst into tears, without shame, without pride, like a man naked before his own soul. He hugged me and repeated, "Born, born, born." My daughter, exhausted, smiled through her tears, and in that smile there was more strength than in any words. Birth brought light where before there was only shadow. Holding that baby for the first time was a miracle. I felt the warmth of life pulsing in my arms, a new breath in the midst of so much pain. My husband approached slowly, hesitantly, as if he was afraid of breaking. When the grandson's little hand grasped his finger, I saw a sparkle in his eyes that I had never seen before. It was as if all the fury he had been holding in had been disarmed by that simple gesture. The baby, without knowing it, was already beginning to heal old wounds. The first hours were of pure surrender. My daughter, still fragile, looked at her son as if he were her own redemption. My husband, who had so often chosen to flee, now remained there, firm, without moving a foot. He spent the night awake, sitting beside the bed, as if watching not only his daughter and grandson, but also himself. I watched in silence, grateful, because I understood that this birth was transforming us. It wasn't just a child who had arrived, it was a new chance for all of us. When I returned home with the baby, the world seemed different. The neighbor, who until then was a constant ghost, disappeared for a few days. The neighborhood was still talking, but the gossip was losing strength in the face of that little boy's innocence. No one could point a finger when they saw the baby wrapped in blankets, with the pure look of someone who knew nothing about adult wars. It was as if life had imposed silence on everyone, at least for a moment. And that moment was enough for us to breathe in peace. My husband began to take on roles I never imagined. He prepared bottles, changed diapers, and rocked the baby in his arms with a patience I had never seen in him. Sometimes he would spend hours watching his grandson sleep, as if he were in front of a mirror that showed him what he could still be. I saw in him not only the grandfather, but also the father he was never able to be to our daughter. It was a silent reparation, a way of making up for lost time. And each gesture was a new brick in the house we were trying to rebuild. My daughter, despite the difficulties, began to blossom again. The smile gradually returned, along with the courage to face the world. She no longer lowered her eyes so much, because she knew she carried in her arms the greatest proof that life goes on, even when everything seems to be falling apart. I watched her hum softly to the baby, as if each note were a plea for forgiveness and a promise of love. It was beautiful and painful at the same time, but above all, it was true. The birth was healing wounds that words could never heal. But deep down, I knew that not everything was resolved. The neighbor was still there, and the wound of betrayal did not heal overnight. The neighborhood still carried their sharp tongues, ready to cut. And my husband still fought daily against the beast he kept inside. But now there was a stronger reason to resist: the baby. And that changed everything, because it was impossible not to want to protect that newly arrived life. That night, when everyone was asleep, I was left alone looking at my grandson. His calm breathing filled the house with peace. And I thought to myself, maybe life gives us pain and then offers us miracles. Perhaps the weight we carry only makes sense when we see what comes from it. Birth did not erase the past, but gave us a future to believe in. And because of that, I knew our story was just beginning. The first few days at home with the baby were like a bomb. His crying, instead of causing grief, seemed to fill the house with life. My husband, transformed by his role as grandfather, displayed a calm I had never seen before. My daughter, even though she was tired, had a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been seen in months. And in the midst of all this, I felt a thread of hope blossom within me. It was as if the world had given us a truce. But I knew that every calm hides something. The neighbor's silence suddenly sounded very suspicious to me. I didn't see him in the yard. I didn't hear the loud laughter from before, nor the heavy footsteps at the gate. It was as if it had disappeared overnight. And this disappearance worried me more than the provocations. Because those who disappear don't give up. They just prepare the ground to return. The neighbors also noticed his absence. Some said he was embarrassed, others that he planned to move. But there were also those who whispered that he was up to something and that sooner or later he would come back to harm our name. I listened to everything in silence, without reacting, but I kept every word inside my chest. Experience had already taught me that a rumor is never just a rumor. There's always a grain of truth hidden there. My husband pretended not to care, but I knew him well. Every time he passed his neighbor's house, he quickened his pace and looked away. It was a quick but revealing gesture. The silence on the other side of the fence fed a monster inside him, a monster that fought not to come out. And I knew that if that silence was broken the wrong way, there would be no way to prevent the damage. It was like living on gunpowder. My daughter, in turn, tried to protect herself in her role as mother. The baby sucked all her energy, and this helped her not to think about the child's father. But every now and then, I caught her looking out the window, as if expecting to see the neighbor suddenly appear. There was fear in his eyes, but also a strange hope that I didn't dare question. It was hard to realize that, even though she was hurt, she still carried a bond with that man within her. A bond one feared would be his undoing. The nights were the hardest. The baby was crying, and fatigue weighed on us all. But what kept me awake at night wasn't the child, it was the silence outside. I would get up, go to the window, and observe the deserted street, the closed gate, the heavy darkness. I felt something moving in the invisible, something about to explode. And the more silence there was, the louder the noise inside me. It was then that one day I found a crumpled piece of paper lying in the yard. I opened it carefully and saw only a scribbled sentence. "This isn't over." My legs trembled and my heart raced as if it were going to burst out of my chest. I kept the note without showing it to anyone, but the certainty set in. The storm was on its way, and we had no way to escape it. Still, I tried to keep the routine. She took care of the baby, cooked, smiled when necessary. But inside, every second was a countdown. He knew his neighbor wouldn't accept being unmasked so easily. He was the kind of man who would rather drag everyone else down than face his own shame. And if I was right, our truce was hanging by a thread. My husband seemed to sense it too. He spoke less, slept little, and kept a constant watchful eye. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night, go to the door, and stand there like a sentry. There was no need to say anything. I knew he expected the worst. And deep down, so do I. The calm we lived in was not true peace. It was just the interval between two thunders. And so we continue, between the baby's lap and the weight of fear, living on a knife's edge. The joy of birth gave us strength, but the silence of our neighbors robbed us of sleep. It was the cruel duality of life, light and shadow walking together. And I, as a mother and wife, knew I needed to be prepared, because fate had already given us enough clues. The storm would come, and come soon. The day dawned heavy, with dark clouds covering the sky like a bad omen. I woke up with my heart racing, feeling like something was about to happen. The silence of the neighborhood did not bring relief, but rather a suffocating weight. Every noise of the gate, every footstep on the sidewalk made me shiver. And deep down I knew there was no way around it. Sooner or later, the confrontation would come to us. It was late that afternoon that everything exploded. My husband was coming back from the market when he met his neighbor on the street. This time, there were no fake smiles, no veiled words. The neighbor looked him straight in the eye and in a cold tone said, "You should take care of your own family instead of poking your nose into mine." The words echoed like a slap. My husband, for a moment, took a deep breath, trying to contain himself. But the blood rushed to his head, and I could see from a distance his body stiffen. I ran to the sidewalk, desperate to stop what already seemed inevitable. "Don't do this," I yelled, grabbing his arm. But his eyes were already clouded with fury. It was as if years of hurt had exploded all at once. The neighbor did not back down. On the contrary, he advanced ironically. "Do you think anyone here believes your daughter is a victim? Everyone knows the truth." That was the trigger. My husband went after him like a bolt of lightning. The two fought, exchanging punches, shouts and shoves, surrounded by the gazes of the neighbors who appeared in a hurry. The entire street seemed to be witnessing a spectacle of misfortune. I threw myself in the middle, trying to separate them, begging them to stop. My daughter, with the baby in her arms, cried at the front door, begging her father to hear her voice. But at that moment, nothing seemed capable of holding him back. The pent-up anger of years, the public humiliation, the pain of seeing her daughter exposed, it all exploded in her fists. The neighbor, covered in blood, still found the strength to spit venom. And every word of his was like fuel thrown on the fire. It took the intervention of two neighbors to restrain my husband. They held him by the shoulders, while he was still bellowing like a wounded animal. I placed myself between them, protecting my neighbor, even though I knew the anger that burned inside me. Because I knew if one more punch was thrown, my husband would go back to prison, and we would lose everything we had achieved. It was necessary to save not only the other person's life, but also our own. The neighbor, staggering, still had the audacity to smile. "It doesn't end here," he muttered, before limping away. Those words were engraved in me like a red-hot iron. It was the promise that we would still face more battles. But at the same time, it was also proof that he hadn't won. Because, despite everything, we were standing. My husband, exhausted, fell to his knees on the sidewalk. The bleeding hands, the panting breath, the lost look. I hugged him tightly, feeling his body tremble from the inside out. He was crying, but not from regret. It was from pain, from frustration, from everything he couldn't control. And in that embrace, I realized there were no villains or heroes, just people crushed by their own choices. It was life, raw and raw, reminding us how unforgiving it can be. That night, silence returned to the street. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it was a heavy silence, laden with unspoken promises and unresolved fears. I knew that confrontation had not been the end, but just another chapter in our battle, and that to protect my daughter and grandson, I would have to be stronger than ever. Because the storm hadn't passed yet, it had just begun. The morning after the confrontation, the entire street seemed to breathe a different air. The windows that once opened to gossip were now ajar, hiding curious eyes. I felt the weight of each neighbor whispering softly, as if our walls had become a spectacle. News of the fight spread faster than the wind, and within a few hours, we were no longer just a family in crisis. We were the scandal of the neighborhood. My daughter, embarrassed, could barely leave the room. And my husband, with his head down, avoided any contact with anyone. His body bore visible marks from the fight, but it was the invisible wounds that worried me most. The silence that settled over him was even more frightening than the fury of the day before. He spent hours sitting on the porch, staring into space, as if trying to find an answer on the horizon that never came. I saw in his eyes a man torn between wounded pride and the fear of losing everything again. And deep down, I knew that internal battle was worse than any punch I had ever received. It was the shadow of the past threatening to pull him back into the abyss. The police came to our door. Two serious-looking officers knocked firmly, asking about the previous night's disturbance. My heart froze the moment I saw the blue uniforms. My husband froze, and I could feel cold sweat running down the back of his neck. I explained, with a trembling voice, that it was all just a misunderstanding, which had already been resolved. Fortunately, perhaps due to lack of evidence or because they didn't want to get into any deeper trouble, they left without taking anyone with them. But the visit left an invisible scar on us. My daughter cried, afraid to see her father return to prison. The baby, innocent, slept oblivious to the chaos, but seemed to carry the weight of our choices with every breath. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that everything would be okay. But inside me, the certainty was fragile, like glass about to shatter. I knew that one more slip-up was enough for us to lose the fragile stability we had achieved. The gossip increased in the following days. They said my daughter had purposely seduced the neighbor, that my husband was a hopeless criminal, that I was blind for trying to keep the family together. Each word was like a stone thrown against our house. And I, who always fought to maintain my dignity, felt my strength drain away. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal or the anger of the fight. It was the relentless judgment of someone who had never lived in our shoes. And that hurt more than any physical injury. Despite everything, something new began to blossom in my husband's heart. He began to grow even more attached to his grandson, finding in him a reason not to give in to hatred. I saw him smile as he rocked the baby, as if that little being held the promise of a better future. It was as if the boy was the anchor that kept him attached to life, preventing him from sinking completely. And for the first time, I realized that maybe change was possible. But it was still too early to be sure. My daughter, little by little, also started to catch her breath. She began to leave her room, take care of her son more firmly, and even face the looks of her neighbors on the street. There was pain in her steps, but also a strength I didn't know she had. The birth had given him a reason to lift his head. And seeing her like that, I felt a silent pride. It was proof that, even in the worst circumstances, life insists on flourishing. I, in turn, tried to hold all the ends together. She was a mother, grandmother, wife, and shield against the evil of the world. But sometimes I felt exhausted, as if I were carrying a burden too heavy for my shoulders. During sleepless nights, I asked God if I would have the strength to carry on. Because the truth is, no matter how much I smiled, there were times when loneliness crushed me. And I needed to hold on, even when everything inside me wanted to fall apart. Little by little, I realized that we could no longer live at the mercy of fear. It was necessary to face the consequences and make decisions. My husband would have to learn to control his anger once and for all. My daughter would have to accept the marks of her choice and move forward as a mother. And I would have to find the courage to guide us all. Because if we didn't do that, the storm would come back even stronger. The consequences of that fight were not limited to the marks on the body. They were wounds in the soul, scars on trust, shadows that would accompany us for a long time. But at the same time, they were also reminders that we were still alive. And that, despite everything, we had each other. Was it little? Maybe. But for me, it was enough to move on. The next few days were like walking through a minefield. Every word needed to be measured, every gesture calculated. I felt that any oversight could reignite the flames of fury in my husband. My daughter, still hurt by shame, sought strength in the baby, who had become her shield and her reason. And I, between the two of us, carried the responsibility of keeping the house standing. But inside me, an inevitable question grew. Was it possible to forgive? Forgiveness was not something that came easily to any of us. My husband, his heart hardened by years of absence and pride, saw in his neighbor only an unforgivable enemy. My daughter, torn between pain and the memory of what she had experienced, didn't know if she hated it or if she still harbored remnants of affection. And I, who always preached the importance of moving forward, found myself facing the biggest test of my life. Because forgiving wasn't forgetting, it was choosing not to let the wound fester. And that choice seemed harder than any battle. One afternoon, as I rocked the baby, I realized how innocent that little being was. He was not to blame for the adults' choices, the mistakes they made, the betrayals and fights. If he wanted to grow up in a healthy home, he would have to pull out the roots of hatred before they grew branches. I looked at my daughter and said, in a firm voice, "Daughter, forgiving is not giving reason. It is freeing yourself." She cried, but did not respond. My husband heard the conversation and stood up, nervous. "You want me to swallow everything he did? To pretend it didn't happen?" I took a deep breath, trying not to provoke his anger any further. "No, I don't want you to destroy what we still have. Hatred will only lead you back to prison. Is that what you want?" He stood silently, staring at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. At that moment, I realized that his fight was not against his neighbor, but against himself. Time passed, and little by little, a change began to happen. It wasn't sudden, nor with grand declarations. It was in the small gestures, when my husband rocked our grandson, when he helped my daughter carry the bags, when he stayed up all night so I could rest. Forgiveness did not enter our home as a noisy visitor. It entered quietly, almost hidden, occupying spaces that were previously filled with resentment. And without realizing it, he began to transform the way we looked at each other. My daughter also showed signs that she was learning. One day, he met his neighbor at the gate. He tried to provoke her, but instead of responding, she just raised her head and walked into the house without saying anything. I saw in her eyes that it had cost her dearly, but I also saw the relief of not letting it overwhelm her. It was the first time I realized she was stronger than she looked. And I understood that forgiveness, for her, was not allowing him to have any more power over her life. I, for my part, began to feel lighter. Not that the pain had gone away, but it no longer consumed me. I learned to look at my neighbor without allowing my soul to corrode inside. It was as if a thorn had been pulled out of his chest. Forgiveness gave me back nights of sleep, gave me back the serenity to look at my family and believe that there was still a future. And, above all, it gave me back my ability to dream. It wasn't easy for my husband. There were relapses, moments when the anger came back with a vengeance, moments when he said he would never be able to forget. But every time he looked at his grandson, something in him softened. It was as if that child was a living reminder that it wasn't worth destroying what little we still had. And little by little, even without admitting it, he also chose forgiveness. Not for the neighbor, but for us. Forgiveness did not erase the past. It did not close all the wounds. But it opened up space so we could breathe without fear, so life could go on. It was a conscious choice, made day after day, sometimes with tears, sometimes with silence. And I understood that forgiving is not a sign of weakness. It is the greatest proof of strength that anyone can give. Because only those who are strong enough can release the chains of resentment. That night, when everyone was asleep, I was left alone looking at my daughter and my husband. The baby was breathing peacefully in the crib, and the moon illuminated the room with a soft light. I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Not because everything was resolved, but because we had taken the first step towards leaving the past behind. Forgiveness, finally, had found a place in our home. And I knew that from then on, nothing would be the same. After choosing forgiveness came the biggest challenge: rebuilding. Forgiveness opens the door, but it takes courage to walk through it. Our house still bore the marks of the storm, not just on the walls, but in the looks, the silences, and the memories. It was like trying to put together the pieces of a broken vase. We knew it would never be the same again, but it could still hold flowers. And that's what I wanted for us, that, even with scars, we would be able to blossom again. My husband began taking timid steps toward a different life. He sought honest work, even if simple, to show himself that he could follow another path. Every time he came home tired but with clean hands, I saw a silent victory in him. It was the beginning of a new identity, more responsible, less a slave to drink and anger. There were still relapses, it's true, but now there was also the will to get up. And that was already a miracle. My daughter, in turn, devoted herself to motherhood. She discovered strengths within herself that she didn't even know she had. In his tired eyes, a precocious maturity appeared, but also a tenderness that only pain can teach. The baby grew up surrounded by care, and I saw in him the energy that united our family. He didn't just breathe, he reminded us every day that life insists on going on. It was living proof that the future can be born from ruins. I also needed to rebuild myself. It was years of holding the bar alone, years in which my heart hardened so as not to fall apart. Now, I realized that I needed to learn to be lighter, to smile again without fear of tomorrow. I started with small things: tending the garden, baking a cake just for fun, humming softly while cleaning the house. Simple gestures, but they gave me back pieces of myself that I had lost in the midst of a storm. It was like lighting candles in a dark room. The neighborhood, however, still carried the sharp tongue. The gossip has diminished, but it has not disappeared. There would always be someone to point out, someone to remember the past, someone to try to trap us in error. But I realized it didn't hurt as much as it used to, because we learned to protect ourselves, to not live according to the gaze of others. Our reconstruction did not depend on acceptance on the street, but on strength within the home. It was in this process that I learned the true meaning of family. It's not about perfection, nor about not making mistakes. It's about staying together when everything says it's easier to let go. It's about offering a shoulder to cry on when someone else is down, and holding their hand even when it shakes. And above all, it's about starting over as many times as necessary. Because love is not the absence of flaws, it is persistence in spite of them. One day, I sat with my husband and daughter at the table. The baby slept on her lap, and the silence that enveloped us was no longer heavy, but serene. I looked at both of them and said, "We may never be seen as a perfect family, but we are our family, and that's enough." They smiled, and in that instant, I felt something in us align. It was as if, finally, we were ready to move forward. The reconstruction was not quick. It was made of small bricks, an apology, a gesture of affection, a conversation without shouting. Every detail was a stone placed in the foundation of the new life we were trying to build. And even though I knew there would always be cracks, I realized they didn't stop us from living. On the contrary, they were signs that we survived. And we survived together. I didn't know what the future held for us. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of him. I knew that we would still face challenges, that our neighbor had not disappeared from our history, that life could test us again. But now we had something we didn't have before, the knowledge that we were strong enough to get back on our feet. And that gave us courage. Because whoever has rebuilt once knows that they can rebuild again and again. That night, as I lay down, I closed my eyes and silently gave thanks. Not for the absence of problems, but for the presence of hope. Rebuilding is not about erasing the past, it is about transforming it into a foundation for a better future. And that's what we were doing, day after day, step by step. Still fragile but determined. And I knew our story wasn't over yet, a new chapter was just beginning. With each passing day, we felt our lives taking on new contours. My husband was working hard, my daughter was growing stronger as a mother, and I was slowly allowing myself to breathe in peace. But there was something that prevented us from moving forward completely, the presence of our neighbor. Even when he wasn't there, his shadow loomed over us. It was like a gray cloud that refused to go away. And deep down, we knew that sooner or later he would come back to haunt us. He never spoke directly to us again after the confrontation, but his absence was almost as threatening as his presence. His silence seemed calculated, as if he were planning something in the shadows. Every time I went out onto the street, I felt his eyes following me, hidden behind the curtains. My daughter avoided walking past his house, and even changed her route to avoid crossing his gate. It was like living in a prison without bars, surrounded by fear. And that undermined our reconstruction. The neighborhood gossip continued to be fueled by him. Made-up stories came out of nowhere, that my husband had threatened me again, that my daughter was still in hiding, that I was covering it all up. It was like fighting an invisible enemy who attacked from behind and never showed his face. Every lie spread was a new wound to heal. And no matter how much we tried to ignore it, there were days when the weight was unbearable. His shadow was too long. My husband, no matter how much he tried to remain calm, could not hide his uneasiness. He would come home with his shoulders tense, looking around as if he expected to be attacked. Sometimes he would stay silent for hours, just turning the glass in his hands, without drinking. It was the portrait of a man at war with himself. I feared that, if provoked, he would lose control again. And this time there would be no second chance. My daughter, for her part, carried a mixture of guilt and fear. She knew that the root of everything came from the forbidden relationship she had had with him. She didn't say it out loud, but I could see the regret in her eyes. At the same time, the baby kept her from giving in to despair. It was in him that she found the strength to face the dirty looks of her neighbors. But still, the neighbor's shadow haunted her like a ghost. I tried to be the foundation, but even I felt fragile. I felt watched, judged, constantly on the verge of collapse. How many times did I think about leaving there, starting over somewhere else where no one knew us? But how can we abandon the house where we built our lives? How could we escape without appearing to give in to his evil? No, it wasn't fair. It was then that I understood. His shadow would only have power as long as we gave it space. If we wanted to truly rebuild, we would need to face this ghost. Not with fights, not with violence, but with the firmness of someone who no longer accepts living cornered. I decided, within myself, that I would not let that shadow dominate my days. And I started preparing my family for the same. It was time to learn to walk with my head held high. But I knew this wouldn't be easy, because the neighbor was not just a man. He was the symbol of all our pain, all our mistakes, all our fears. Facing him was, at the same time, facing ourselves. My husband would have to fight his own fury. My daughter would have to face her own guilt. And I would have to keep the balance for all of us. That night, when silence filled the street, I stared out the window. I saw the light in his house on, a shadow walking back and forth. I couldn't sleep a wink until dawn, because deep down I knew it wasn't over yet. The neighbor's shadow was not just a threat. It was the certainty that our history would still face its most difficult part. And, with a heavy heart, I understood that the real battle was yet to come. Not against what had already happened, but against what could still happen. It was like living on the edge of a cliff, not knowing when the ground would give way. And I, once again, would have to be the wall of my family. Because if we were not strong, his shadow would swallow us. And I wouldn't allow that. Life is like that. When we least expect it, the truth opens its way. And it was no different with the neighbor. For months, he maintained the posture of a respectable man, an exemplary father, and a devoted husband. But masks, no matter how well fitted, cannot withstand the weight of time. Little by little, cracks began to appear. And what he hid so much, one day came to light in front of everyone. It all started with little comments made by his wife. She appeared on the street with red eyes, trying to smile to hide it. But no neighborhood forgives signs of weakness. Rumors soon surfaced of violent arguments within the house. My heart filled with a mixture of anger and compassion. Anger at knowing that he was the cause of so much pain. Compassion for that woman who, like me, also carried burdens in silence. And, without wanting to, I saw myself reflected in her. The final blow came on a rainy night. Screams echoed through the street, so loud that no one could ignore them. The wife ran out, with her daughters clutching her hands, calling for help. It was the first time I saw my neighbor lose his composure in front of everyone, without the mask of a good man. There, exposed in the mud of his own arrogance, he showed who he really was. And for the first time, the neighborhood turned its judgmental eyes not on us, but on him. My husband, who was fighting so hard against his own fury, watched the scene in silence. I saw in his eyes not only relief, but also a strange sense of justice. He didn't need to raise his hand. He didn't need to stain himself again. Life took care of exposing the enemy. And that, in a way, freed him. He took a deep breath, as if releasing an old weight. And I realized that maybe this was the beginning of a new page for us. My daughter, still scarred by memories, cried when she saw her neighbor. Not of pain, but of empathy. It was as if she finally understood that she had been used too, that she had been nothing more than another piece in his game. And in that recognition, he found the strength to forgive himself. I saw her hug the baby tighter, as if she were swearing never to repeat the same mistakes. And in that gesture, I felt that she was reborn. The neighbors, once so ready to point the finger at us, were now murmuring against him. The tongues that wounded us began to taste their own poison. Suddenly, we were no longer the scandal of the street. We were survivors. And, as cruel as it sounds, that brought some relief. Not because we wished misfortune on others, but because, finally, the truth was revealed. And the truth always brings liberation. I myself, when I saw his mask fall, felt a mixture of sensations. Part of me wanted to scream. I knew it. But another part just sighed wearily. There was no victory in seeing the other family's pain. What there was the bitter lesson that evil never lasts forever. Sooner or later, it destroys itself. That night, after the commotion had died down, I sat on the porch. The rain was still falling lightly, washing the street as if erasing tracks. My husband came closer, placed his hand over mine, and simply said, "He finished." It wasn't the end of all troubles, I knew, but it was the end of the shadow that haunted us. The fall of his mask did not erase our scars, but it brought something we hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Peace of walking down the street without lowering my head, peace of knowing that the truth has finally shown, peace of seeing my family breathing a sigh of relief. And deep down, I understood that life gives us justice in unexpected ways. Not with revenge, but with revelation. And that revelation was all we needed. At that moment, I understood that our biggest fight was not against him. It was against fear, against resentment, against the weight of the past. And when I saw the mask fall, I realized we were free. Free to rebuild without shadows, without accusations, without the pain of carrying guilt that wasn't ours. The street would never be the same again, and neither would we. But for the first time, I felt like we could walk without looking back. After so much storm, the time has come to relearn how to live. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't like flipping a switch. The new beginning came little by little, like the dawn that slowly announces itself on the horizon. I felt a mixture of tiredness and hope inside me, like someone who has survived a shipwreck and now steps onto solid ground. The past was still there, engraved in our memories, but it no longer imprisoned us. It was like a scar, visible but no longer painful. My husband, who once wore rage like a second skin, seemed like a different man. The days of hard work shaped him differently. He no longer spoke of revenge, no longer held grudges. He preferred to spend his energy on what really mattered. When I arrived home and held my grandson in my arms, I saw a tenderness in him that I had never seen before. It was as if that baby had remade his story, giving him a second chance at being a father through the role of grandfather. And this transformation was, for me, one of the greatest victories. My daughter blossomed with motherhood. She, who had previously felt marked by shame, now walked with her head held high. Not because the neighborhood's views had changed at all, but because she learned not to live at their mercy. The baby was her strength, her reason to move forward without fear. And in every act of care, in every sleepless night, I saw the birth of a woman stronger than that girl who one day made a mistake. She discovered that true love is the kind that gives without expecting anything in return. As for me, I learned to reinvent myself. These were years of resistance, of carrying burdens in silence. Now, I realized that I also deserved to be happy. I began to dedicate myself to small joys, planting flowers in the yard, writing letters I never sent, humming old songs while I cooked. Simple things, but they brought color back into my life. The new beginning was not just about rebuilding the family, but about rebuilding myself as a woman. The neighbor, once a constant shadow, was no longer part of our present. After the mask fell, he became just another face erased by life. The street stopped being the stage for gossip about us and started to comment on other stories. It was strange, after so long in the eye of the storm, to go back to being just another house in the neighborhood. But I confess, it was a relief. Normality has a value that only those who have lived through chaos can recognize. Deep down, we knew that starting over didn't erase the past. The wounds existed, the memories too. But we learned that there was no need to forget them. We just had to not let them define us. Our history would not only be remembered for our mistakes, but also for our overcoming. And that, for me, was enough. Because every tear shed had become a step to get us here. One sunny afternoon, I sat on the porch with my husband and daughter. The baby played on the rug, laughing loudly, as if he owned the world. I looked at the two beside me and felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Look, I thought we survived. And we didn't just survive, We managed to transform pain into strength, chaos into learning, failure into a new beginning. It was as if life had finally given us a breath of freedom. The reconstruction of our family was also the reconstruction of each one of us. We learned to look forward without fear, to accept our failures without shame, to value what really matters. And if one day life tests us again, I know we will be more prepared. Not because we are perfect, but because we understand that it is always possible to start over. Starting over isn't about going back to what was before, it's about creating something new with what's left. And we created. That night, before going to sleep, I looked out the window at the sky. The stars shone as if they too were celebrating our rebirth. I closed my eyes and silently gave thanks, not for the absence of pain, but for the strength to move forward. A true new beginning is not given by life, it is chosen. And we choose. And that choice made all the difference. And so, between tears and smiles, our story found a new path. Not a perfect path, but our own path, where we learned that even from the worst falls a new life can be born. Because in the end, the true new beginning is not in what we lost, but in what we were able to build afterwards. And we were finally ready to live this new phase. With courage, with hope, and above all with love. Always with love. Today, looking back, I see that the pain that almost destroyed us was the same pain that taught us how to truly live. My daughter, who once carried shame in her eyes, found her strength in motherhood. My husband, who has always been a prisoner of his own anger, discovered in his grandson's arms what it means to love without limits. And I, who so often feared I wouldn't be able to handle it, learned that no storm is capable of drowning those who decide to swim to the other shore. Life has shown me that overcoming is not about forgetting what happened, but learning to walk with the scars without letting them define who we are. The neighbor fell, his mask was broken, but we chose not to live in revenge. We choose forgiveness, not as an excuse, but as freedom. And in this simple gesture, we rediscover the peace that seemed lost. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that the true strength of a family is not in never making mistakes, but in rising together after falling. Because in the end, when everything seems lost, there is still a chance to start over. And starting over, I learned, is the greatest miracle that life can offer us.